I knew something was entirely wrong the moment I saw my parents seated beside the swinging kitchen doors, treated like temporary staff instead of the family of the bride. When I confronted his mother, her cruel excuse echoed across the head table, while my future husband merely shrugged. I did not shed a tear. I walked straight to the soundboard, took the microphone, and completely shattered their perfect evening and their $100 million corporate deal by sunrise. My name is Sienna Rogers. At 33 years old, I have built my life and my career on the principle of paying attention. As a community strategy expert at Northline Civic Strategy, my daily work involves navigating the complex, often unspoken dynamics of people, power, and shared spaces. I consider myself intelligent, inherently calm, and entirely allergic to the flashy, hollow displays of status that consume so many people in the corporate world. Because I spend my days analyzing how physical spaces dictate social hierarchies, I possess a razor-sharp sensitivity to disrespect. It is a trait that makes me excellent at my job. But tonight, it turned my own wedding reception into a scene of quiet horror. A little over an hour ago, I stood at the altar and married Graham Whitmore. He is the golden son of the Whitmore family, a dynasty of staggering wealth anchored by their massive real estate development firm, Whitmore Urban Holdings. The marriage was supposed to be the blending of two very different worlds, but stepping into the reception, it felt like a corporate acquisition. Our celebration took place at the Cedar and Glass Ballroom in the affluent heart of West Haven, Illinois. It is a venue known for its breathtaking architecture, featuring soaring windows that look out over manicured grounds and a massive vaulted ceiling draped in delicate lights. It was undeniably opulent, bathed in the soft glow of hundreds of pillar candles, yet, taking my first steps into the grand hall as a married woman, a heavy, suffocating feeling settled over my chest. Something was fundamentally wrong. The cinematic perfection of the room was entirely superficial. Beneath the surface, the atmosphere hummed with a cold, calculated energy. The guest list had swelled far beyond the intimate gathering Graham and I had originally discussed. Everywhere I looked, I saw strangers. There were clusters of men in bespoke, razor-sharp suits, nursing their expensive drinks and leaning into conversations that looked less like celebratory chatter and more like intense negotiations. There were women in designer silk, their smiles tight, and their eyes constantly scanning the room to see who was talking to whom. These were not the warm, joyous faces of family or lifelong friends. These were strategic invitations. A sickening knot tightened in my stomach as a memory surfaced from exactly 3 weeks ago. Graham had come to my apartment, pacing the floor and running his hands through his hair, pleading with me to let his mother handle the final seating chart. Miranda Whitmore is a formidable woman who wields her social influence like a weapon, Graham had insisted, with that practiced, charming sincerity of his, that his mother was simply a master at hosting high-level guests. He argued that allowing her to manage the logistics would save us both a tremendous amount of stress. I had felt an immediate flash of resistance. A wedding is deeply personal, and yielding control of where people sat felt like yielding control of the event itself. But I chose to compromise. I took a deep breath, buried my irritation, and agreed. I reasoned with myself that it was merely an issue of tables and chairs, a small sacrifice to maintain the peace and show my willingness to integrate into his family. Standing at the edge of the dance floor, the sheer scale of my naivety crashed over me. I looked toward the front of the room, to the prime seating areas immediately surrounding the head table where Graham and I were supposed to sit. These tables should have been reserved for the people who loved us most. Instead, the seats were packed with a registry of the West Haven elite. I recognized a prominent real estate attorney who frequently represented developers in zoning disputes. I saw several deep-pocketed corporate financiers. Most glaringly, sitting at the absolute best table in the house, was a key city planning commissioner alongside two well-known figures from the local business media. They were already toasting, laughing loudly, utterly disconnected from the emotional weight of a marriage ceremony. The entire front half of the ballroom looked like an executive board meeting disguised in white floral arrangements. A sharp panic began to pulse behind my ribs. I turned my attention away from the corporate showcase at the front and began frantically scanning the middle section of the room, searching for the people who actually mattered. I was looking for my parents. My father, Thomas Rogers, is a man whose hands are permanently calloused from 40 years of honest, grinding work as a mechanic running his own small garage. My mother, Elaine Rogers, spent decades as a dedicated community library manager before transitioning into a relentless neighborhood volunteer coordinator. They are warm, genuine, salt-of-the-earth people. I expected to see my father looking slightly stiff but endlessly proud in his rented tuxedo. I expected to see my mother beaming, eager to celebrate her only daughter. I checked the tables designated for the extended families. They were not there. I scanned the tables assigned to my college friends and former coworkers. They were missing. The glamorous faces of the Whitmore clan and their endless associates blurred together as my gaze swept further and further back, moving away from the light, away from the music, away from the center of attention. My eyes finally stopped moving. The breath left my lungs in a sudden, painful rush. At the absolute edge of the room, shoved into a dark, cramped corner right next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, sat a single, small round table. The frantic, chaotic energy of the waitstaff flowed constantly through those doors. Every time the heavy doors swung open, a blast of stifling heat and the harsh, jarring noise of clattering silverware and shouting chefs spilled over the table. Sitting there, physically exiled to the very fringes of the room, completely isolated from the celebration, were my parents. They looked incredibly small, engulfed by the shadows and the noise of the service entrance. The delicate string quartet playing near the stage could not possibly reach them over the din of the kitchen. They had been treated not as the honored parents of the bride, but as an unsightly inconvenience that needed to be hidden away. In that singular, crystal-clear moment, the lingering anxiety I felt transformed into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly calm. I forced my legs to move, pulling myself away from the glittering center of the room and navigating through the labyrinth of tables. With every step I took toward the swinging service doors, the ambient temperature seemed to rise, carrying the heavy clashing scents of roasted meats and industrial dish soap. The gentle string music that floated over the main floor faded into insignificance, replaced entirely by the chaotic, relentless symphony of culinary service. Waiters rushed past me with large silver trays, their movements hurried and panicked. When I finally reached the small round table, the reality of the insult settled deep into my bones. My mother was staring down at her lap, her fingers rapidly and repeatedly smoothing the edge of the crisp white tablecloth. It was a nervous habit she only displayed when she felt entirely out of place or deeply embarrassed. She kept her eyes averted, refusing to look at the grand spectacle happening behind her, beside her. My father sat rigidly upright. He had arranged his face into a mask of stoic pleasantry. His shoulders squared in a desperate attempt to look dignified, so I would not worry. He offered me a tight, encouraging smile, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Every time the kitchen doors swung open, a harsh blast of heat washed over them, accompanied by the muffled shouts of the head chef. They were sitting in an active thoroughfare, breathing in hot, greasy air. I rested my hands lightly on my mother's shoulders, feeling the tight knots vibrating through her frame. I wanted to apologize, to drag them out of there immediately, but my brain was still struggling to process the sheer audacity of the situation, seeking some logical explanation. My eyes darted across the expansive room, searching for the rest of my modest guest list. It did not take long to locate my aunt and my cousin. They were seated at the very opposite end of the hall, tucked into a narrow, dimly lit alcove directly adjacent to the main restrooms. A steady stream of guests brushed past the back of their chairs, the heavy wooden restroom doors opening and closing with rhythmic, hollow thuds. They were completely severed from the heart of the celebration, treated like an embarrassing afterthought pushed into the absolute margins of the venue. A cold wave of total clarity washed over me. I turned on my heel and marched back out to the foyer, where the grand gilded seating chart was still displayed on an elegant golden easel. The names were written in beautiful flowing calligraphy on thick parchment paper. I stood before it and read the assignments row by row. It was a masterclass in social segregation. Every single member of the extended Whitmore family, along with Graham's university fraternity brothers and his weekend golf partners, occupied the prime real estate surrounding the dance floor, even the plus ones of Graham's junior colleagues, people I had never met in my entire life and who had no connection to our relationship, were granted tables significantly closer to the stage than my own parents. The visual evidence was undeniable. This was not a logistical error. This was a calculated, deliberate exile. I pivoted and scanned the main room for the architect of this humiliation. I spotted Miranda Whitmore holding court near the premium open bar. She wore an icy blue designer gown that caught the candlelight, and she held a crystal flute of champagne, laughing softly with a cluster of women draped in heavy diamonds. I did not run, but my strides were purposeful, sharp, and driven by a quiet fury. I approached her, ignoring the customary pleasantries, and stood close enough to force her to stop speaking. I asked her, keeping my voice steady and dangerously low, exactly why my parents had been banished to the kitchen entrance while absolute strangers occupied the front rows. Miranda did not flinch. She did not lean in to whisper or attempt to manage the conflict discreetly. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne and answered in a voice loud enough to carry over the ambient chatter of the surrounding guests. She stated clearly that my parents simply were not suited to sit near the important guests. She tilted her head slightly, a patronizing, pitying smile touching the corners of her lips, and added that she did not want the obvious class difference to ruin the sophisticated atmosphere of the evening. The women standing around her froze. The clinking of glasses at the bar stopped abruptly. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over our immediate vicinity. Several heads turned in our direction, eyes wide with shock. I stood perfectly still, waiting for the punchline. I waited for her to let out a theatrical laugh, to claim it was a terrible, tasteless joke born from the stress of hosting such a massive event. But Miranda's expression remained perfectly serene and entirely serious. She meant every single word she had just spoken. She felt absolutely justified in saying it out loud in a room full of people. My chest tightened to the point of physical pain. I turned my head, desperately seeking the one person who was supposed to be my partner in all things. Graham was standing just a few feet away, holding a half-empty highball glass. He had heard the entire exchange. The people around us were watching him, waiting to see how the groom would defend his new bride. I looked directly into his eyes, silently begging him to intervene, to reprimand his mother, to show even a fraction of the outrage that was currently burning through my veins. Graham stepped closer to me, leaning in so only I could hear his response. He told me to keep my voice down. He whispered that I should not make a big deal out of nothing, insisting that it was just a matter of seating arrangements. Then, he offered a careless, dismissive shrug. That singular indifferent motion severed something fundamental inside my soul. The shrug was infinitely worse than his mother's cruelty. Miranda's insult was a direct attack from an obvious adversary, but Graham's dismissal was a profound, world-altering betrayal. In that fraction of a second, the illusion of our partnership completely evaporated. The issue was no longer about where people sat to eat a catered meal. The horrifying truth crashed down upon me. My husband was perfectly willing to watch my family be publicly humiliated, stripped of their dignity on our wedding day. As long as it kept his mother happy and his flawless high society event running smoothly, the man I had legally bound myself to only a few hours ago had just shown me exactly who he was. The love I thought I felt for him instantly died, hardening into a cold, unbreakable weapon. I turned my back on my new husband and his mother without uttering another syllable to either of them. The time for private pleading had instantly vanished, replaced by a cold and calculating drive. I navigated back through the crowded floor, but my destination was no longer the head table. I walked with deliberate and measured steps toward the elevated audio-visual booth located at the far right perimeter of the hall. The polished hardwood floor felt solid beneath my heels. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my chin leveled, projecting an aura of complete control that masked the furious pounding of my heart. I approached the soundboard where the event technician, a young man wearing a black polo shirt and heavy headphones around his neck, was monitoring the intricate mixing console. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly as the bride suddenly appeared in his secluded workspace. I extended my right hand toward him. I kept my expression completely neutral and politely asked him to hand me the primary wireless microphone. He blinked, clearly confused by the deviation from the meticulously planned timeline. But he instinctively reached out and placed the cool metal cylinder into my palm. I then instructed him, in a tone that left zero room for debate, to completely cut the ambient music. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his fingers hovering over the glowing buttons, before he slid the master volume fader all the way down to 0. The sudden and absolute silence was deafening. The gentle instrumental jazz that had been blanketing the room evaporated, immediately sucking the low hum of hundreds of overlapping conversations right out of the air. Heads began to swivel. Hundreds of faces turned toward the front of the ballroom, their expressions shifting from relaxed distraction to polite anticipation. The guests clearly assumed I was about to deliver a traditional and tearful welcome speech, thanking everyone for their generous gifts and shared joy. I stepped up onto the small raised platform near the edge of the dance floor so I could be easily seen by the majority of the room. I tapped the microphone twice with my index finger. The sharp amplified thuds echoed sharply off the soaring glass windows and vaulted ceilings. I raised the microphone to my lips and began speaking in a smooth and remarkably steady voice. I welcomed everyone to the celebration. I expressed my profound gratitude that so many people had traveled great distances to be there. Then, I deliberately adjusted my vocabulary. I extended a special and pointed welcome to the esteemed corporate partners and the highly distinguished civic guests in attendance. I let those specific and sterile business terms hang heavily in the air. They were words that belonged in a boardroom, not a bridal toast, and I watched as a subtle wave of discomfort rippled through the front rows. Several men in sharp suits shifted uneasily in their velvet chairs, glancing sideways at their colleagues. Having secured their undivided attention, I shifted my physical stance. I announced clearly that before the catering staff began serving the first course of the evening, it was absolutely imperative that I introduce the two most vital and foundational people in my entire existence. I stepped down from the small platform. I did not cast a single glance in the direction of my husband or my mother-in-law. Instead, I began to walk slowly and purposefully down the wide center aisle, moving directly away from the extravagant head table and the cluster of elite guests, the venue spotlight operator, sensing a theatrical moment unfolding, scrambled to adjust his equipment, casting a warm tracking circle of light that followed my every step. I walked past the towering floral centerpieces bursting with white orchids. I walked past the bewildered real estate attorneys who held their wine glasses suspended in midair. I walked past the local media figures who were suddenly sitting very upright, their journalistic instincts flaring to life. I kept walking until I traversed the entire length of the massive hall, stopping only when I reached the absolute back wall. Standing directly in front of the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, the bright spotlight followed me, suddenly illuminating the small and cramped table shoved into the shadows. My parents flinched slightly against the unexpected glare. I stepped right beside my father's chair and placed my free hand firmly on his shoulder. Anchoring myself to him, I brought the microphone back to my mouth, ensuring my voice rang out with crystal clarity across the silent expanse of the room. I introduced Thomas Rogers to the crowd of millionaires and power brokers. I told them about a man who spent 40 long years pulling heavy engine blocks apart and scrubbing thick industrial grease from his knuckles every single night. I spoke of a man who worked brutal 12-hour shifts in a sweltering garage, sacrificing his own physical comfort simply so his daughter could graduate from a private university without a single dollar of debt. I then turned my body slightly and rested my hand on my mother's shoulder. I introduced Elaine Rogers, I described a woman who had taken a dilapidated and underfunded neighborhood building and relentlessly transformed it into a vibrant and thriving community library. I painted a picture of a woman who created a safe and welcoming harbor where local children learned to read and lonely elderly residents found daily and meaningful companionship. I did not make my voice shake. I did not plead for the room's sympathy. I spoke with the fierce and unyielding pride of a daughter who intimately knew the true and immeasurable value of the human being sitting beside her. For one long and suspended heartbeat, there was utter silence in the grand ballroom. Then, a man seated near the front row, one of the prominent civic leaders my mother-in-law had been so desperate to impress, slowly raised his hands and began to clap. The applause caught instantly, spreading like wildfire across the venue. It rippled through the massive space, growing louder and more resonant until the sound became a tangible and physical force. Guests all over the room began physically lifting and turning their heavy wooden chairs around to face the back wall, eager to see the people I was honoring. As the genuine applause washed over us, I watched the faces of the individuals seated in the premium front sections. A distinct wave of profound and burning embarrassment swept through those tables as the stark reality of the seating arrangement finally dawned on them. They suddenly realized they were sitting in the seats of highest honor, while the actual parents of the bride had been intentionally pushed against the noisy service entrance. I waited patiently for the applause to naturally subside before I spoke again. I walked a few paces forward, moving away from the kitchen doors and approaching a table situated dead center in the room. It was currently occupied by a group of my husband's younger fraternity brothers and their dates. I offered them a bright, perfectly polite, and entirely unyielding smile. I spoke directly to them, my voice still amplified for the entire room to hear. I asked if they would be so incredibly kind and gracious as to offer their central seats to my parents, noting politely that the acoustics back by the kitchen doors were simply less than ideal for enjoying the evening's upcoming speeches. I barely finished my sentence before a young man in a dark tailored suit scrambled to his feet. He practically tripped over the legs of his own chair in his desperate haste to comply, nodding vigorously with wide eyes. His tablemates immediately followed his lead, practically vaulting out of their seats. They grabbed their suit jackets and small clutch purses, visibly eager to escape the sudden and glaring pressure of the entire room's focused attention. The venue's catering staff, expertly sensing the severe shift in the room's dynamic and desperate to maintain order, rushed forward to assist. In a flurry of coordinated movement, they expertly cleared the center table, whisking away the used glasses, resetting the pristine silver cutlery, and pouring fresh iced water in a matter of seconds. I offered my arm to my mother, gently escorting her away from the harsh heat of the kitchen draft. My father walked proudly beside us, his spine perfectly straight. The guests spontaneously began to applaud again, creating a warm and continuous rhythm of respect as my parents took their rightful and newly acquired seats right in the very heart of the beautiful venue. Once I was certain they were comfortably settled and being attended to, I took a deliberate step back. I looked out over the vast sea of faces. I let my gaze drift momentarily over my new husband, who was staring at me from the head table with a volatile mixture of shock and tightly suppressed anger. I then looked at my mother-in-law, watching closely as her icy and flawless composure finally began to show visible and jagged cracks. I raised the microphone to my lips one last time. I delivered a single and final sentence that sliced cleanly through any remaining tension and silenced the room completely. I stated clearly, looking directly at the head table, that tonight was my wedding celebration, and absolutely no one I love would ever be treated like an afterthought. The dinner service resumed, but the fundamental gravity of the room had completely shifted. The invisible barrier that had previously cordoned off the front tables dissolved into thin air. Between the serving of the roasted sea bass and the pouring of the second round of Cabernet, something remarkable occurred. The highly curated guests, the very people my mother-in-law had tried to shield from my family, began gravitating toward the center of the room. A prominent city councilwoman pulled up an empty chair next to my mother, laughing loudly at a story about a chaotic community book drive. Two corporate lawyers, Men who earlier seemed carved from solid ice were leaning over the table. Deeply engaged in a conversation with my father, they found my parents to be exactly who they were, which was warm, authentic, and utterly charming. The stark contrast between their genuine grace and the derogatory caricature Miranda had painted was impossible for anyone to ignore. The clinking of silverware eventually gave way to the traditional toasts. The maid of honor and the best man delivered their speeches, full of the usual light-hearted anecdotes and polite well-wishes. As the applause for the best man faded, a sudden movement at the head table caught the collective eye of the room. Miranda Whitmore did not wait for the bandleader to introduce her. She simply stood up, smoothing the skirt of her designer gown, and glided toward the microphone stand. She took the device with a practiced elegance, her smile radiant, but completely devoid of warmth. Her voice, when it echoed through the massive speakers, was dipped in honey, yet underneath the sweetness lay a rigid and controlling steel. She began by speaking about the beautiful union of two families, her tone initially hitting all the acceptable and expected notes. But within seconds, the trajectory of her speech began to curve. The sentimentality evaporated, replaced by carefully chosen corporate rhetoric. She started emphasizing the paramount importance of reputation and the heavy burden of upholding established standards. She looked out over the crowd, her eyes deliberately sweeping past my parents' new table as she spoke about the solemn responsibility of maintaining a flawless image, specifically mentioning the expectations of their valued investors and partners. The air in the ballroom grew incredibly thin. She offered a tight and patronizing smile, noting that when welcoming individuals from vastly different environments into established circles of influence, one must be exceedingly patient. She insinuated, with devastating politeness, that it would naturally take a significant amount of time for certain people to learn the delicate nuances of behaving appropriately within high society. The insult was draped in silk, but it was a direct and undeniable strike aimed squarely at my bloodline. I sat paralyzed in my chair, my blood running like ice water through my veins. The sheer audacity of her passive-aggressive public shaming left a bitter taste in my mouth. I slowly turned my head to look at Graham. This was the moment. This was the exact second he needed to stand up, to interrupt her, to do absolutely anything to defend his wife and her family from a calculated humiliation. I watched his profile, desperately waiting for a muscle in his jaw to tighten, for him to reach out and pull the microphone away from her. But he did nothing. He sat perfectly still, staring blankly at his water glass. His silence was not just an absence of action, it was an endorsement. It was the final and crushing confirmation that I was entirely alone in this marriage. The polite and highly uncomfortable smattering of applause that followed Miranda's speech died abruptly, before the band could strike up a filler chord. A deep and resonant voice cut through the heavy atmosphere. It did not come through the sound system. It came from a man sitting at a prominent table near the front. Nolan Pierce, the founder of the region's largest infrastructure fund and the absolute linchpin of the Whitmore family's upcoming financial quarter, remained seated but spoke with a natural authority that demanded absolute attention. He leaned back in his chair, resting one hand on the linen tablecloth. He stated, clearly and casually, that in his 45 years of navigating the cutthroat business world, he had learned one absolute truth. He said he never judged the caliber of a human being by the table they were assigned to sit at, nor did he evaluate their worth by the type of labor their hands performed. The entire room collectively held its breath. Miranda froze near the stage, her manicured fingers gripping the microphone stand tightly enough to turn her knuckles white. Nolan then turned his head, completely ignoring the Whitmore family at the head table, and looked directly at the center of the room. He called out to my father, his tone shifting to genuine camaraderie. He mentioned that he had overheard my father discussing vintage automotive restoration during the cocktail hour. He asked my father a highly specific question about rebuilding a classic transmission, a topic they had apparently bonded over while the rest of the room was busy posturing for power. That single and unscripted exchange acted like a localized earthquake. the heavy hitters of West Haven, the executives and politicians who had been hanging on Miranda's every word just moments before, immediately stopped clapping and shifted their focus. The rigid social hierarchy of the room had just been effortlessly dismantled by the wealthiest man in the building. As I watched the sheer panic flash behind Miranda's carefully constructed mask, a new and dangerous realization bloomed in my mind. Her cruelty was not just a matter of elitist snobbery. The Whitmore family empire was built entirely on perception, and by publicly insulting my family, she had accidentally exposed their arrogance to the exact people holding the purse strings. I began to see that this careless insult had struck the one nerve they guarded above all else. Their carefully curated image in front of their investors was suddenly bleeding, and the night was far from over. The heavy oak door of our penthouse hotel suite clicked shut, sealing us inside a stifling and suffocating silence. It was supposedly our wedding night, the culmination of over a year of planning, yet the atmosphere felt like the freezing aftermath of a violent collision. Graham did not move to embrace me. He did not ask if I was emotionally intact. Instead, he immediately tore the silk bow tie from his collar, threw it forcefully onto a velvet armchair, and began to pace the length of the room. When he finally spoke, his voice dripped with an ugly and resentful condescension. He did not condemn his mother for her cruelty. He squarely blamed me for deliberately embarrassing Miranda in front of the most critical and powerful guests in the room. He accused me of taking a minor logistical oversight and turning it into a theatrical spectacle that humiliated his family on a grand scale. I stood frozen near the entryway, still suffocating beneath the layers of my heavy beaded gown. The sheer delusion of his accusations stripped away the last lingering thread of affection I held for him. I looked directly into his flushed face and asked him a single, uncompromising question. I asked how I could possibly be expected to trust him with my future, my well-being, or our potential life together, if he was entirely incapable of defending my parents from basic human degradation on the very first day of our marriage. I demanded to know how he could sit there and watch them be humiliated without lifting a single finger. Graham refused to meet my gaze. He deflected the question entirely, waving his hands in a frantic and dismissive gesture. He muttered that I was overly emotional, exhausted from the day, and completely blowing things out of proportion. He told me to drop the subject immediately, insisting that we would sit down and discuss my outburst after we returned from our 2-week honeymoon in Europe. He desperately wanted to sweep the public degradation of my family under the rug like spilled wine. But there would be no peaceful resolution, and there certainly would not be any honeymoon. The tension in the suite was soon shattered by the relentless and piercing vibration of his cell phone. It started shortly after midnight. Graham had retreated to the adjoining living area, leaving me alone in the dark bedroom. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, listening as the phone rang over and over again, every time it buzzed against the glass coffee table. I heard his frantic and hushed voice answer. It was his father calling, then his mother, then what sounded like their corporate legal counsel. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the heavy wooden door separating the rooms was left slightly ajar. I held my breath, straining to hear the panicked rhythm of his pacing footsteps. His voice rose in pitch, completely shedding its usual polished confidence. I clearly heard him practically begging the person on the other end of the line. He said Nolan had walked out of the reception hours before the cake was even cut. He frantically repeated that they could not afford to pause the signing under any circumstances. I heard him slam his fist against a table, his voice cracking as he declared that they had to fix the optics immediately because right now was the absolute worst time for a major investor to pull out. He was not talking about a ruined wedding. He was talking about a collapsing business deal. Exhaustion eventually forced me into a fitful and dreamless sleep. When I finally opened my eyes, pale morning sunlight was filtering through the sheer curtains. The suite was deathly quiet. I pulled myself out of bed and walked into the living room. Graham was sprawled awkwardly across the leather sofa, fully dressed, snoring heavily with his phone still clutched in his hand. I walked past him toward the entryway, intending to leave the hotel immediately. As I grabbed my coat, My foot bumped against a row of heavy canvas gift bags left behind by the event coordinators. They were the premium guest favors intended for the important attendees sitting at the front tables. A strange and undeniable instinct urged me to look inside. I crouched down and reached into the nearest bag. Beneath the decorative tissue paper, resting heavy at the bottom, was a thick and professionally bound linen folder. I pulled it out into the light. It did not feature our wedding monogram. Stamped aggressively across the cover in sharp gold foil was the corporate emblem for Whitmore Urban Holdings. I broke the thick wax seal and opened the heavy cardstock cover. It was not a commemorative keepsake. It was a highly confidential capital pitch deck, a comprehensive financial proposal designed to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for a massive new commercial real estate development called the Harbor Ridge Redevelopment. I slowly flipped through the glossy pages, my eyes scanning past architectural renderings and projected revenue charts. Then, my blood ran entirely cold. I stopped turning the pages. About halfway through the document was a dedicated section titled Local Community Support and Integration. The page was explicitly designed to reassure nervous investors that the surrounding neighborhoods were thrilled about the massive construction project. Staring back at me from the glossy paper were high-resolution photographs of several prominent community leaders, and right in the dead center of the layout, smiling warmly, were my own parents. Underneath the photograph of Thomas and Elaine Rogers was a fabricated and glowing endorsement praising the visionary development plans of the Whitmore family. My hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy folder nearly slipped from my grasp. My parents had never endorsed this project. They vehemently opposed it. For the past 6 months, my mother had been organizing town hall meetings and drafting petitions to block this exact development, terrified that it would completely bulldoze and gentrify the historic working-class residential sectors of our city. The Whitmores had stolen their faces and their hard-earned community credibility to construct a massive and fraudulent lie. In a blinding flash of clarity, every single bizarre detail of the previous night suddenly snapped together to form a terrifying picture. The bloated guest list of corporate strangers, the aggressive front-row seating for the financiers. Miranda did not banish my parents to the kitchen doors simply out of snobbish contempt. It was not a mere social slight. It was a desperate and calculated cover-up. She shoved them into the darkest and most inaccessible corner of the ballroom to guarantee that the heavy-hitting investors sitting at the front tables would never have the opportunity to speak to them. If Nolan Pierce or any of the other deep-pocketed executives had wandered over to my father, shook his hand, and casually thanked him for his public support of the Harbor Ridge project, the entire million-dollar fraud would have detonated right there on the dance floor. They had hijacked my wedding ceremony to distribute falsified investment materials to captive billionaires. And far worse, they had treated the people I loved most in the world like disposable and inconvenient props, simply to keep their criminal deception hidden in the shadows. I slipped out of the hotel suite before Graham even stirred, clutching the heavy linen folder tightly against my chest. The crisp morning air did little to clear the blinding anger simmering in my blood. I hailed a cab and headed straight to a quiet diner on the edge of the city, a place far removed from the polished marble and crystal chandeliers of West Haven. I had texted my parents to meet me there at 8 in the morning. When I slid into the vinyl booth across from them, the exhaustion on their faces was palpable. They tried to offer warm smiles, but the shadows under their eyes told the true story of the previous night. I did not waste time with gentle pleasantries. I placed the Whitmore Urban Holdings pitch deck flat on the laminated table and pushed it toward them. I instructed my mother to open it to the middle section. Elaine adjusted her reading glasses, her brow furrowing in confusion as she flipped past the financial projections. When she reached the page titled Local Community Support and Integration, the color completely drained from her face. She stared at the high-resolution photograph of herself and my father, situated right above a glowing endorsement of the Harbor Ridge project. She traced the printed words with a trembling finger, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. She looked up at me, her voice tight and defensive, declaring absolutely that she had never signed a single document supporting that monstrosity. She reiterated that she had spent the last 6 months organizing local residents against it. My father leaned in, his calloused hands resting heavily on the table as he scrutinized the image. A dark realization suddenly washed over his features. He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. He recalled a neighborhood block party that took place about 3 months ago. He explained that a young woman in a sharp blazer had approached them. Claiming to be a community liaison for a local developer, she had asked to take their picture for what she described as internal documentation regarding community engagement efforts. He admitted, his voice laced with bitter regret, that he had not suspected a thing. He thought they were just documenting their outreach, not manufacturing a fraudulent endorsement. Before I could process the full weight of his admission, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The caller ID displayed the name Tessa Lane. Tessa was Graham's cousin and a junior member of the event planning team that had orchestrated the wedding. We had always maintained a cordial but distant relationship, so her calling me this early was highly unusual. I answered, keeping my voice low. Tessa sounded frantic, her breath catching as she demanded we meet immediately. She stated she had something I needed to know right now, something she could not risk saying over a phone call. I left my parents with the folder and a promise to call them later. Catching another cab to a secluded coffee shop Tessa had specified. When I arrived, she was already sitting in a corner booth, anxiously tearing a paper napkin into tiny shreds. She looked terrified, but the moment I sat down, she pushed her laptop across the table. The screen displayed a forwarded internal email chain from Miranda Whitmore to the lead event coordinator. I read the words illuminated on the screen. The directive was chillingly clear. Miranda had explicitly written out the seating assignments, followed by a bolded instruction demanding the coordinators ensure my family was kept entirely isolated. The exact phrase read, "Do not let them sit near the investment fund or planning tables." Tessa swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the small cafe to ensure no one was listening. She leaned forward and confessed the entire ugly truth. She explained that the wedding reception was never actually about celebrating a marriage. In the upper echelons of the Whitmore empire, it was internally referred to as a softening event. The entire evening was a meticulously staged production designed to close the final funding round for the Harbor Ridge redevelopment. Tessa revealed that the Whitmores desperately needed to project an aura of strong community ties and local approval to appease a few hesitant investors. They had weaponized the emotional weight of a family wedding to create a false sense of security and trust, using my parents' fabricated support as the ultimate selling point. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text message from the lead videographer we had hired. He had been a quiet, observant professional throughout the day. His message was brief but explosive. He stated that his secondary camera, positioned near the stage, had captured raw audio of Miranda's speech that was significantly clearer than anything currently circulating online. He noted that the footage explicitly caught a muttered comment she made just as she approached the microphone, a vile remark complaining about people from the working class who only know how to protest. He offered to send me the unedited file. The pieces were no longer just falling into place. They were slamming together to form a concrete wall of evidence. But the final and most devastating blow came a moment later. Tessa reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of thick stationery. She slid it across the table, her hand shaking slightly. She whispered that Nolan Pierce had quietly asked her to pass this along to me before he left the venue last night. I unfolded the note. It was written in sharp, elegant handwriting. Nolan stated simply that he believed there were severe signs of misrepresented community information within the documents the Whitmores had circulated. He requested that I contact him privately at my earliest convenience. I sat back against the wooden booth, the air suddenly feeling thin and sharp in my lungs. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. This was no longer a simple matter of a cruel mother-in-law and a spineless husband. This was not just a family drama or a dispute over a seating chart. The Whitmore family had engaged in deliberate, calculated corporate fraud. They had forged endorsements, manipulated local stakeholders, and utilized a massive business deal to pave over the very community my parents had spent their lives building. And they had used my wedding, the day I pledged my life to their son, as the theatrical prop to pull it all off. The sadness and the heartbreak I had felt the night before completely evaporated. The tears I thought I might shed for my ruined marriage dried up instantly. I looked at Tessa, who was watching me with wide, fearful eyes, waiting for me to break down. But I did not break. I carefully folded Nolan's note and slipped it into my pocket, my mind already calculating the velocity of the storm I was about to unleash. I returned to the penthouse suite shortly before noon. The heavy silence of the hotel corridor felt entirely different now, no longer a luxurious escape, but a long, suffocating tunnel leading into a trap. When I pushed open the door, Graham was already awake. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, his sleeves casually rolled up to the elbows, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the silver carafe on the kitchen island. He looked perfectly rested, completely unbothered, as if the world had not shattered beneath our feet the previous evening. I did not take off my coat. I walked directly across the thick carpet and slammed the heavy linen folder onto the marble countertop. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet room. I pushed the open pages toward him, demanding a clear and immediate explanation for the fabricated endorsement featuring my parents. Graham barely flinched. He glanced down at the glossy page, his expression carefully and instantly arranged into a mask of innocent confusion. He shook his head slowly, claiming he had absolutely no idea what I was showing him. He insisted it must have been a severe oversight by their marketing department, a rough draft that accidentally made it into the final printing. He tried to offer a sympathetic smile. Reaching out to gently touch my arm, I stepped back, entirely out of his reach. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the printed screenshot of the internal email Tessa had shown me at the diner. I placed it deliberately on top of the brochure, right over the photograph of my mother and father. It was the email thread proving he had been directly copied on the final approved draft exactly 3 days before I walked down the aisle. The sympathetic husband routine vanished instantly. Graham set his coffee mug down with a hard clatter. He stopped playing the ignorant victim and shifted effortlessly into the role of a corporate damage control executive. He let out a harsh, exasperated sigh and ran a hand through his hair. He looked at me not with guilt, but with intense annoyance. He told me I was completely overreacting to a standard business practice. He insisted the text in the brochure was simply aggressive marketing language, a minor and necessary exaggeration to secure critical funding, and absolutely not a fraudulent act. He crossed his arms over his chest, adopting a patronizing tone, and told me that my silence right now was the only viable path forward. He claimed keeping quiet would save both of our families from a massive, destructive, and entirely avoidable public scandal. His audacity was breathtaking. But he was not finished. He smoothly laid out his proposed strategy to fix the mess his mother had created. He wanted me to log on to my social media accounts immediately and draft a highly visible public statement. He suggested I blame the palpable tension at the reception on severe wedding day stress and high emotions. He explicitly instructed me to frame the offensive seating arrangement as a simple logistical misunderstanding, and to absolutely never mention the existence of the investment brochure to anyone. He promised me that if I just played along and let things cool down for a few weeks, he would make everything up to me. I stared at him, my stomach turning violently, but the final, fatal blow was yet to come. Frustrated by my stony silence, Graham pushed harder, revealing the darkest piece of his strategy. He reminded me of the prenuptial agreement he had practically shoved in front of me a week prior. The document he had relentlessly claimed was just a standard formality required to protect his family trust. He casually mentioned a highly specific clause buried deep within the legal jargon, a clause I had questioned but he had smoothly dismissed as boilerplate text. He stated, with chilling clarity, that the clause formally intertwined our professional assets and networks. He admitted that Whitmore Urban Holdings desperately needed direct and unhindered access to the grassroots community organizations I had spent my entire career building at Northline Civic Strategy. He needed my sterling professional credibility and my established relationships to bypass the exact local zoning boards that were currently stalling the Harbor Ridge project. The floor seemed to completely drop out from beneath me. The intense betrayal I had felt the night before was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, calculated reality standing in front of me right now. He did not just fail to defend me against his mother, he had specifically targeted me, my spotless professional reputation, my deep and genuine ties to the local working-class neighborhoods, and my parents' unshakable authenticity were never things he loved or respected. They were simply assets to be acquired. I was not his bride. I was a strategic corporate merger meant to whitewash his family's ruthless and predatory real estate expansion. I turned away from him without saying a word and walked straight into the master bedroom. I pulled my suitcase from the closet and began throwing my clothes inside. I did not bother folding anything. I tossed my shoes, my cosmetics, and my everyday clothes into the bag in a frantic blur. I refused to sign another piece of paper for him, and I certainly would never draft a single lie to protect his empire. I zipped the bag shut with a sharp, violent motion and walked back out to the living area. I gripped the handle of my luggage tightly. I looked at the man I had legally bound myself to less than 24 hours ago. I kept my voice incredibly steady, ensuring every single syllable hit its mark. I told him he did not lose me over a cruel speech or a bad table assignment. I told him he lost me the exact moment he looked at my self-respect and calculated it as a public relations expense. I expected him to panic. I expected him to scramble, to beg, or perhaps finally offer a desperate and genuine apology to save his own skin. Instead, his posture rigidified. His eyes went completely dead, devoid of any human emotion. The charming golden boy facade vanished entirely, leaving behind a ruthless man who was accustomed to crushing obstacles beneath his expensive shoes. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a terrifying and flat precision. He warned me that if I walked out that door and attempted to take any of this information public, I would be going up against people vastly more powerful than I could ever possibly comprehend. He promised me, his voice devoid of any inflection, that they would completely destroy my career, bankrupt my family with endless legal battles, and make absolutely sure I deeply regretted the day I ever decided to cross them. I did not offer him a response. I turned my back on his empty threats, opened the heavy hotel door, and walked out into the hallway, leaving the total wreckage of my marriage behind me. I retreated to my childhood home, sitting at the familiar scratched oak dining table where my mother and I had spent countless evenings organizing library fundraisers. The urge to scream, to tear my ruined wedding dress into useless shreds, and to broadcast a furious, emotional tirade online burned fiercely in the back of my throat. But I swallowed the bile and the heartbreak down. Screaming, crying, and public hysteria were exactly what the Whitmore family expected from a scorned bride. They had armies of public relations experts who could easily spin an emotional outburst into the tragic ramblings of an unstable woman. I was a community strategist. I knew intimately how to dismantle a false narrative, and you do not do it with tears. You do it brick by meticulously placed brick, using cold, hard facts. We hired an independent civil attorney, a sharply intelligent woman named Valerie, who specialized entirely in corporate overreach and defamation. Together with my mother, we spent several hours meticulously drafting our response. The atmosphere in the dining room was clinical and determined. We stripped away every single adjective, every subjective accusation of cruelty, and every emotional grievance. What remained was a lean, devastatingly neutral statement containing only undeniable, provable facts. While Valerie finalized the legal paperwork, I compiled a comprehensive digital dossier. I scanned the glossy pages of the investment brochure featuring my parents' faces. I attached the screenshot of the internal email chain explicitly demanding their isolation from the financial tables. Finally, I uploaded the raw, unedited, high-definition video file of Miranda's speech, captured flawlessly by the secondary camera. I did not send this explosive package to the local press or the gossip blogs. I bypassed the media circus entirely. Instead, I sent the encrypted file directly to Nolan Pierce and, crucially, copied the senior legal compliance officers at his infrastructure fund. In the corporate world, emotional drama is an annoyance, but compliance risks and fraudulent representations are lethal poison, simultaneously. Valerie formally served Whitmore Urban Holdings with an official legal demand. The cease and desist letter was razor-sharp and completely devoid of any family familiarity. It legally demanded that the corporation immediately halt any and all unauthorized use of Thomas and Elaine Rogers' names, likenesses, and fabricated quotes in all capital raising materials. We gave their legal department exactly 24 hours to provide formal written confirmation of their total compliance, or we would file an immediate public injunction that would freeze their entire fundraising campaign. Just as the delivery receipt for the legal notice pinged on Valerie's laptop, my cell phone chimed with a secure message. It was Tessa. She had spent her morning quietly digging through the event planning archives and had uncovered a holy grail of malicious intent. She sent over a high-resolution photograph of the original, preliminary seating chart drafted over a month ago, right there, situated at the premier table directly next to the groom's family. Were my parents, but slashed aggressively across their printed names were thick, dark strokes of red ink, moving them to the kitchen doors. In the margins, Miranda had handwritten a blunt note citing the need for better optics. It was undeniable proof of premeditation. Then, an entirely unexpected ally emerged from the shadows of the event staff. The venue's lead guest coordinator, completely disgusted by the blatant disrespect she had witnessed the night before, reached out to me through a mutual contact. She provided a sworn written statement confirming a deeply unsettling and legally precarious detail. During the reception, she and her staff had been explicitly instructed to hand-deliver specialized VIP gift bags directly to the tables occupied by the corporate financiers. These specific bags contained heavy supplemental investment addendums. Her testimony officially confirmed that the Whitmores had transformed a legally sanctioned marriage celebration into an unregistered securities pitching floor, slipping financial documents to investors under the guise of wedding favors. With my arsenal fully assembled and legally vetted, I opened my professional social media profile. I did not tag Graham. I did not mention Whitmore Urban Holdings by their corporate name. I wrote a public post consisting of exactly 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph stated simply that my parents, a mechanic and a librarian, had been intentionally degraded and hidden away at my wedding reception due to their working-class background. The second paragraph revealed the core issue, stating that their faces and names were simultaneously being used without their knowledge or consent in a major commercial real estate investment brochure to falsely project local community support. The third paragraph simply stated that integrity cannot be fabricated for a pitch deck. I attached a clear photograph of the fraudulent brochure page, the original red ink seating chart, and the crisp video clip of Miranda delivering her thinly veiled insults. Then, I pressed publish. I expected a moderate reaction from my immediate civic circles. I vastly underestimated the devastating power of undeniable proof combined with raw-class insult. Within 2 hours, the post ignited. It bled rapidly out of my personal network and surged into the wider civic and political channels I had cultivated for years. The public narrative shifted instantly and violently. The citizens of West Haven did not view this as a messy divorce or a petty family squabble over table linens. They saw a glaring, highly documented instance of wealthy, untouchable developers exploiting and manipulating local citizens for massive financial gain. The comment section transformed from offering sympathetic condolences into a mobilized war room of local activists, legal professionals, and investigative journalists demanding answers. By the time the sun began to set on my first day as a separated woman, the spark had turned into a raging civic fire. A prominent and highly organized coalition of residents from the Harbor Ridge neighborhood, the exact historical area slated for demolition by the new project, released their own urgent press release, citing the indisputable evidence I had just made public. They formally announced their intention to demand an immediate, comprehensive emergency review of every single community consent record the developers had ever submitted to the City Planning Council. The Whitmore family had spent millions of dollars trying to control the narrative and secure their legacy. but with 3 simple paragraphs and a steadfast refusal to be silenced. I had just introduced a catastrophic fracture into their foundation. The Whitmore public relations machine did not stay quiet for long. By the time I poured my second cup of coffee the following morning, Miranda was already broadcasting her defense across the premier local news network. She sat in a plush studio chair, wearing a soft pastel blouse designed to make her look maternal and approachable, with a perfectly rehearsed expression of sorrow. She painted a picture of a chaotic wedding day ruined by a highly sensitive and overzealous bride. She casually dismissed her vile comments as a lighthearted, poorly timed joke about cultural differences that I had maliciously blown out of proportion. She played the victim flawlessly, attempting to reframe my factual exposure as the hysterical revenge of a woman who could not handle the pressure of marrying into a prominent family. Less than 2 hours after her broadcast aired, a courier marched up my parents' driveway and aggressively shoved a thick, legal-sized envelope into my hands. It was a formal threat from the most expensive corporate litigation firm in the state. They accused me of malicious defamation and demanded I permanently delete my public statement within 12 hours or face a massive civil lawsuit aimed at completely bankrupting my family. My stomach plummeted as I read the aggressive legal jargon. But when I handed the document to Valerie, our attorney simply smiled. She pointed to a specific paragraph buried on the second page. In their rush to intimidate me, their high-priced lawyers had made a fatal error. The document explicitly stated that the marketing materials utilizing the Rogers family name were merely internal drafts and conceptual mock-ups. By attempting to minimize the brochure, their own legal counsel had officially and explicitly admitted that the Whitmore organization had, in fact, created the unauthorized materials. They had just handed us written verification of their own deception. My phone buzzed constantly, vibrating against the wooden dining table. It was a barrage of text messages from Graham. His tone had shifted completely from cold intimidation to desperate manipulation. He typed paragraph after paragraph claiming that he still loved me and insisting there was still a viable path to save our newly minted marriage. His grand solution was for me to put on a nice dress, stand by his side at a highly publicized press conference that afternoon, and announce to the city that the entire ordeal was simply a massive mutual misunderstanding exacerbated by exhaustion. He promised that if I helped him protect the company stock, he would buy us a house anywhere I wanted. I looked away from the glowing screen and glanced at my parents. The relentless stress of the past 48 hours was visibly taking its toll. News vans were beginning to circle our quiet suburban block. The telephone rang incessantly with journalists hunting for a quote. My father sat heavily in his recliner, rubbing his temples, while my mother stared blankly out the kitchen window. A heavy wave of suffocating guilt crashed over me. I had dragged their quiet, dignified lives into a vicious, high-profile mudslinging contest. For a fleeting and dangerous second, I genuinely considered giving up. I considered deleting the post, accepting Graham's hollow truce, and simply disappearing to spare my family any further agony. My mother must have seen the resignation dropping over my shoulders. She turned away from the window, walked directly across the room, and gripped both of my hands with astonishing strength. Her eyes were fiercely bright. She told me in a voice that left absolutely no room for debate that I was not allowed to quit. She stated clearly that she was perfectly capable of surviving the arrogant disdain of wealthy snobs, but she vehemently declared that she absolutely refused to survive being utilized as a forged, silent piece of evidence to destroy her own neighborhood. She squeezed my hands tightly, anchoring me back to reality, and ordered me to finish exactly what I had started. The momentum violently swung back in our favor just past noon. Valerie received a secure, confidential update from the legal compliance department at Nolan Pierce's infrastructure fund. Nolan had not merely walked away from the massive funding round. He had taken the digital dossier I provided, recognized the severe legal liabilities, and formally handed the entire Whitmore Urban Holdings portfolio over to an aggressive team of independent forensic auditors. Nolan strongly suspected that the fabricated endorsements at my wedding were not an isolated incident. He believed the Whitmores had been systemically inflating their community approval metrics and forging consent records across dozens of municipal projects spanning the last 5 years. The withdrawal of his capital was devastating, but the impending federal audit was an absolute death sentence for their empire. Panic was clearly erupting inside the developer's corporate headquarters. Tessa sent me a frantic, encrypted message from a burner phone. She had intercepted a chaotic directive from Miranda's executive assistant. Knowing the zoning council was now under immense public pressure, Miranda was desperately attempting to rewrite history before the government could act. Tessa revealed that the Whitmore legal team was drafting an emergency addendum to submit to the city planning board that very afternoon. They were attempting to retroactively reclassify my mother's vocal protests at a past town hall meeting, twisting the public record to list her as a registered neutral supporter who had simply attended a consultation session. It was a blatant, desperate act of perjury designed to legitimize their fraudulent pitch deck. We did not give them the chance to file their lies. Valerie and I spent the next 3 hours operating at blinding speed. We assembled an airtight, impenetrable counter-dossier. We included the time-stamped email chains from Tessa, the sworn affidavit from the venue coordinator regarding the hidden investment bags, the high-definition audio files, and my parents' notarized declarations of absolute non-consent. We drove directly to the West Haven Municipal Building and officially lodged our comprehensive grievance with the City Planning Council clerk. Beating Miranda's team by a mere 30 minutes, the fallout was instantaneous and explosive. By early evening, the Municipal Council released an unprecedented public notice to every major news outlet in the region, citing severe allegations of corporate fraud and the intentional misrepresentation of civic constituents. The board officially suspended the Harbor Ridge development application. Furthermore, they announced the immediate convening of an emergency, open-door public hearing scheduled for the following night. The sole purpose of the hearing was to publicly investigate the validity of the community consent files submitted by the Whitmore family. Miranda Whitmore had spent her entire life dominating elegant ballrooms and silencing opposition behind closed mahogany doors. She undoubtedly believed she could waltz into the municipal chambers, flash her designer smile, and effortlessly control the narrative as she always had. She thought the hearing was her ultimate stage to crush a rebellious bride, but as I reviewed my perfectly organized stacks of undeniable evidence, a cold and quiet confidence settled into my bones. She was walking into the one arena where her money could not rewrite the facts, and this time, I was ready for her. The West Haven Municipal Chambers were designed to hold exactly 250 citizens, but by the time the emergency public hearing was called to order, there was only standing room left. The heavy oak doors were propped open to accommodate the overflow crowd spilling into the marble hallways. I sat at the front petitioner table with my parents on my left and Valerie on my right. Behind us sat a dense sea of local residents, eager local reporters clutching notepads, heavily suited representatives from various investment funds, and astonishingly, several faces I clearly recognized from my own wedding reception. The entire city had ground to a halt to witness the spectacle. Miranda Whitmore was the first to approach the microphone. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of composed authority. She did not look nervous. She spoke with the same steady, melodic cadence she had used during her disastrous toast, attempting to expertly weave a narrative of domestic triviality. She stood before the council members and confidently dismissed the uproar as a deeply unfortunate cultural family misunderstanding. She smiled sympathetically, framing me as an overwhelmed bride reacting poorly to the intense pressures of a high society event, and explicitly urged the council to completely separate a private family dispute from the massive economic benefits of the Harbor Ridge project. When my turn came, I did not stand up with a trembling voice or tearful eyes. I did not launch into a personal attack against her character. I simply stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and laid out the absolute truth in chronological order. I started by detailing the sudden alteration of the seating chart. Moving my parents to the kitchen doors, I moved on to the exact phrasing of her derogatory speech. Then, I revealed the existence of the investment brochures, explicitly describing how they used my parents' names and photographs without any shred of permission. Finally, I detailed the true, hidden purpose of the reception, explaining how VIP guest bags, stuffed with financial pitches, were strategically distributed to wealthy investors while the bride and groom were taking photographs. As I spoke, Valerie stood beside me and formally submitted copies of our master dossier to each of the 7 council members. The heavy thuds of the thick binders hitting the wooden dais echoed through the silent room. The council members opened the files, their eyes scanning the high-resolution images of Elaine and Thomas printed in the developer pitch deck. Valerie directed their attention to the authenticated internal email where Miranda explicitly ordered her event staff to keep the Rogers family away from the investment fund tables. The final documents in the binder were the legally binding, notarized affidavits from my parents, stating under penalty of perjury that they had never consented to support the project. The room was already vibrating with tension, but the final, devastating blow came from the back of the chamber. Our wedding videographer, appearing under a strict legal subpoena Valerie had secured that morning, walked down the center aisle. He handed a secure flash drive to the council clerk. He explained that his secondary camera had captured a highly specific piece of audio just seconds before Miranda took the stage at the reception. The clerk plugged the drive into the chamber sound system. A burst of static filled the room, followed by the crisp, undeniable sound of Miranda Whitmore whispering urgently to her lead assistant. Her voice echoed off the chamber walls, instructing the assistant to absolutely not let the Rogers couple talk to Nolan Pierce or his table for too long. The chamber erupted into a chaotic chorus of gasps and angry murmurs. The council chairman had to strike his heavy wooden gavel against his desk 3 times to restore order. Sensing the total collapse of his family empire, Graham jumped up from the gallery seating and practically sprinted toward the podium. He held his hands up in a desperate pacifying gesture, begging the council for a moment to speak and promising to calm the situation down and clarify the administrative errors. Before he could even begin his prepared spin, the lead planning commissioner leaned forward, his face etched in absolute disgust. He looked Graham dead in the eye and asked him a direct, unyielding question. He demanded to know if Graham was aware that the multi-million-dollar fundraising documents utilized his new wife and her family as fabricated community props without their legal consent. Graham froze. The smooth golden boy charm evaporated instantly. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at his mother, then at the council, and finally at me. He stammered, shifting his weight nervously from side to side. His suffocating, prolonged silence gave every single person in the room the only answer they needed. The chairman did not wait for Graham to find his voice. He called for an immediate motion. Within 2 minutes, the planning board voted unanimously to completely and indefinitely suspend the Harbor Ridge redevelopment application. Furthermore, they officially mandated a sweeping, independent forensic review of every single community consent document Whitmore Urban Holdings had submitted over the past 10 years. Before the gavel even fell to close the session, a sharply dressed attorney representing Nolan Pierce stood up from the gallery. He announced for the public record that his fund was officially terminating all financial negotiations and withdrawing their capital commitments from the Whitmore organization pending the results of the city audit. The grand, untouchable Whitmore legacy crumbled into ash in a matter of an hour. I did not stay to watch them scramble through the swarm of reporters waiting by the exit. I gathered my files, turned away from the podium, and walked to the back of the room where my parents were waiting for me. My father placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder, and my mother pulled me into a tight embrace. As we walked out into the cool evening air together, I stopped on the concrete steps of the municipal building. I looked down at my left hand, slid the heavy diamond ring off my finger, and dropped it into my purse. I chose to end the marriage right there in the dark. I realized then that I had not destroyed the Whitmore family with a vicious, calculated campaign of dirty revenge. All I had done was refuse to let them hide my parents in the shadows by the kitchen doors. And the rest of their empire simply collapsed because every single brick of it was built on a foundation of arrogance and lies. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories.